Well, good evening. Oh, come on, this is a Transylvania event. Good evening. That's what I was expecting. Glad to have you all here. Welcome to the campus of champions. I don't get tired saying that. My name is Brian Lewis. I have the honor both of serving as the 28th president of the university and also as the person who gets to welcome you to this event. I'm so glad to see you all here, and I know you are as excited as I am to hear from such a distinguished guest tonight. Someone who I think will very appropriately engage and challenge us in keeping with this year's creative intelligence theme of skeptical odysseys. Now, as some of you know, this series was created in 1985 by my distinguished predecessor and cherished friend, President Charles Shearer. Oh, please, yes, a round for Dr. Shearer. And in recent years, the director of the Creative Intelligence series has coordinated the Kenan Lecture. So many thanks to our current director, Professor Gregory Partain, for arranging this evening. As repeat visitors to this occasion will know, our past lecturers have included an amazingly diverse range of speakers, distinguished novelists and historians and U.S. poet laureates, Nobel Prize-winning physicists and peacemakers, the principal investigator on the Mars rover project that NASA launched. We've had Academy Award-nominated actors, international opera stars, the first woman to serve as president of Ireland, the highest-ranking defector from the Soviet Union, and now a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist. So welcome to the William R. Kenan Jr. Lecture Series, funded by a grant from the William R. Kenan Jr. Charitable Trust. Just a word or two about Mr. Kenan. He was born in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1872. He attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and there found his passion for chemical and mechanical engineering. He went on to a widely diverse career, including serving as president of the Flagler System, the Traders Paper Company, and the Western Block Company, and he owned a farm where he had a prized Jersey herd that was nationally known. Mr. Kenan gave a significant portion of his estate to establishing a trust for educational purposes. And after his death, the Charitable Trust started its formal grant-making program, and that trust has continued to contribute to conversations about the pressing issues of the day and has focused on initiatives that improve literacy and college preparedness, to contribute to community building and economic vitality, and to inspire a sense of collective purpose and shared humanity. We are grateful for the generous support of the Trust and of the many friends of Transylvania University who have enabled this series of programs over the decades. We look forward to continuing this marvelous tradition with unique opportunities to interact with some of the most compelling people on the planet. And to that end, I am delighted to bring to the podium the president of our Student Government Association, Issa Leone, who will introduce our distinguished visitor. Please welcome Issa.
Thank you, President Lewis, and thank you all for being here. It's not often that we have a Pulitzer Prize winner on campus, and it is my honor to introduce Mr. Ed Yong, science journalist, author, and former staff writer at Atlantic Magazine. Dr. Yong is the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the Victor Cohn Prize for Medical Science Reporting, the George Polk Award for Science Reporting, and the Benton Award for Distinguished Public Service. But it was during the COVID pandemic, when we were confused and desperate for answers, that his riveting and informative reporting earned him the Pulitzer in explanatory journalism. And it was in his subsequent groundbreaking coverage of long COVID that Yong reaffirmed his belief that, quote, science is not the objective, neutral force it is often misconstrued as. I won't claim to be a scientist, as my roommate, a brilliant biology major, can attest to. But as my roommate can confirm, I'm intrigued by the lives of animals. I've often wondered, does my dog Jake sense when I'm upset or happy? Does my rabbit Munchie travel to his bowl when I eat because of chance, or because of some connection he feels to me? Do Jake, Munchie, and other animals experience the world like I do, or is their reality something fundamentally different? Yong's most recent book answers many such questions. Published in 2022, An Immense World: How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us has received glowing praise. It was a New York Times bestseller, won the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence, and was named one of the best books of the year by Oprah Daily, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and many others. All the speakers and events on this year's Creative Intelligence series, with its theme, Skeptical Odysseys Through a Glass Darkly, have challenged us to engage in skeptical inquiry, to honestly question our assumptions in the pursuit of a capital T truth, if such a thing exists, and to accept that someone else might come at things from a different perspective and hold a different truth every bit as real and valid as our own. There's no better person than Mr. Yong to lead us on the next step in that journey of skepticism and discovery. Please help me give a warm transy welcome to our 2024 William R. Kenan lecturer, Mr. Ed Yong.
Just 1 second. Hello. I'm really grateful to Isa for that wonderful introduction and for mentioning their pets, because I'm going to do the same. Let me introduce you to my dog. Thank you. This is Typo. Good name for a writer's dog. Typo is a corgi, as you can see. When people first meet Typo, they tend to focus on his eyes, which are extremely cute, or his ears, which are extremely cute. But tonight, I want you to instead focus on his nose. And it's arguably the most important part of that adorable face, and certainly Typo's main interface with the world, the main sense organ through which he perceives his surroundings. When he encounters anything new, he explores it with his nose, intently, intentionally, and enthusiastically. Every dog owner here will know that feeling when you go for a walk with your dog and you're trotting along quite happily, and then they grind to a halt and just furiously investigate some piece of pavement or sidewalk that looks completely nondescript to you, but is clearly bursting with information and interest to their nose. I think that is a sign that dogs exist in a very different world than what we perceive, a world dominated by smell. The hardware at the end of a dog's face, their nose, is beautifully adapted to give them a continuous experience of that scented world. When you breathe in, a single stream of air goes through your nose and down into your lungs. On the way, it is intercepted by cells that recognize the shapes of the different molecules in that airstream. And that is the first step to us perceiving smells. When a dog inhales, structures inside its nose cleave that airstream in two. One big river goes down into the lungs and is specifically for breathing. And the other goes to the back of the snout into a chamber that is dedicated for smell, and smell alone. That chamber isn't easily voided. It doesn't deplete whenever the dog breathes out. And so it is getting this constantly replenishing bucket of scented air going into its face. Also, you'll notice that on the side of a dog's nose, its nostrils curve around. They make these interesting apostrophe shapes. Maybe you've noticed this on your own dog and wondered why that is the case. Well, if you imagine a dog sniffing along a surface, you might imagine that every time it breathes out, it would blow away all of the scented molecules that have accumulated on that surface. But actually what happens is, when it breathes out, those side slits create rotating vortices of air that sweep those scented molecules inside the nose. So no matter whether a dog is inhaling or exhaling, it is getting this constant conveyor belt of scent going into its nose, into that special chamber. And so while my sense of smell tends to be a bit flickering, like if you've ever tried to follow a scent, you'll notice that your perception like blinks in and out as you inhale and exhale. With the dogs, I think it's continuous. I think it's like our sense of vision. And as I said, dogs use their nose all the time. When dogs encounter each other for the first time, they will sniff each other. When dogs encounter anything new, they will sniff that. I think we humans sometimes forget this. Dog owners often take their dogs on walks, thinking about the walks as exercise or travel from A to B. We pull our dogs along if they stop to smell something, and I think that's to their detriment. It would be like you went on a hike with a friend, and every time you stopped to observe a beautiful viewpoint, your friend clasped their hands over your eyes and dragged you along the path. That's sort of what we're doing to dogs by depriving them of their main sense through which they experience the world. The point is this. Dogs are very familiar to us. We love them very much, even when we are in the same physical space, even when we're standing next to each other. If Typo was on this podium with me right now, firstly, that would be terrible. He would be all over the place, no controlling him. He's a corgi, he's very stubborn. But also, we would have radically different experiences of that space. That shared physical world would seem totally different to the two of us because our senses work in different ways. There is a wonderful word for this difference, for the sensory world that we live in. It is Umwelt. This is simply German for environment, but as popularized by scientists for the last 100 years, Umwelt has a special connotation when thinking about the senses. It doesn't just mean the physical environment, so my Umwelt is not this podium or this microphone. My Umwelt is the part of the world that I can perceive. It is the unique cocktail of smells and sights and sounds and textures that I am privy to, and that another animal might not be privy to. Each individual in each species has its own bespoke Umwelt, its own bespoke part of the world that it can perceive. This, I think, is one of the most beautiful concepts in all of biology. First, it's very humbling. It tells us that for all of our vaunted intelligence and our technology, our experience of the world is always partial. We are only at best perceiving a thin sliver of the fullness of reality. But for the same reason, the Umwelt concept is incredibly expansive. It tells us that all the time, even in the most familiar of surroundings, there are unfamiliar things for us to think about, to know about. The Umwelt concept hints at flickers of the magical in the mundane and the extraordinary always in the ordinary. So here is a whirlwind tour of the kinds of things that we as humans are missing because they are not part of our Umwelt. Many animals can sense the magnetic field of the Earth itself. So migrating songbirds and sea turtles can use the Earth's magnetic field to guide them on their long, epic journeys. We can only do this with the aid of technology, with a compass and the app on my phone. These animals have inbuilt biological compasses inside their bodies. If you take that bird, a Eurasian robin, and put it in a dark room, devoid of any other landmarks or information, when it comes time for it to migrate, it will still know exactly the right way to go and hop in that direction. A sea turtle that hatches off on the coast of Florida will head into the water and make a clockwise loop around the entire Atlantic over the course of a decade. If you take that baby turtle and put it in a laboratory and expose it to the kinds of magnetic fields it would experience at different points along that journey, it will orient as if it were there, as if it was, say, off the coast of Portugal, as opposed to off the coast of Florida. And it will do this even if it has never been in the water before. This is a rattlesnake. On the tip of its head, it has 2 nostrils, but behind those, it has 2 other openings, which are called pits. That's why these snakes are called pit vipers. Those pits can detect the body heat of the snake's warm-blooded prey, things like rats and mice. The snake can sense the infrared radiation given off by those warm bodies and use them to hunt even under conditions of total darkness. If it's very dark where you're currently sitting, you may be faintly aware of the body heat of the person sitting next to you. But if you're a rattlesnake sitting on my head, you could detect the body heat of a mouse sitting at the tip of my finger with enough accuracy to strike it. Even blind rattlesnakes can hunt in this way. The neurons that go from the pit organs eventually merge and mingle with those coming from the snake's eyes. And some scientists believe that the snake effectively sees in heat, that infrared is just another color to it, like all the ones that we are familiar with. I said that the snake's ability allows it to hunt in darkness, and indeed many extraordinary senses have evolved under those kinds of conditions, where vision is much less relevant and useful. This animal is a star-nosed mole. It lives throughout the eastern United States, but is very rarely seen because it lives most of its life underground. The mole looks like, I guess, a mole that has run into a sea anemone and got stuck. Or perhaps an animal with 2 grasping open hands at the end of its face. That is essentially what the star is. It is one of the natural world's most exquisite organs of touch. As the mole runs along, it presses its starry nose against the walls of its dark tunnels. And in doing so, it can recognize the distinctive feel and texture of, say, a juicy earthworm against that of the surrounding soil. And it is so fast and sensitive that it can press its star against a bit of soil, recognize a worm, eat it, and then move on to another press in about a quarter of a second, which is about as fast as a human blink. Bats also combine exceptional speed with incredible sensory abilities. Most bats can do a thing called echolocation, where they produce high-frequency calls, too high for us to hear, very, very quickly, up to hundreds of times a second. They are listening for the echoes that those calls make when they bounce off objects in the bat's environment. And by very, very precisely timing how long it takes for their calls to return back to them, the bat can gauge distance to objects around it with millimeter precision, enough to pluck a spider from its web or to snatch a moth from midair. This ability, echolocation, was really only discovered in the mid-40s. And the scientists who learned about it, to everyone, were very, very often disbelieved. The sense seemed so strange that you would, see with your ears, that other scientists would grab some of these pioneers at conferences, shake them by the lapels and go, you possibly can't actually mean that. And yet, it turned out to be true. I think the fact that most people cannot echolocate blinds us to the possibility of this extraordinary sense. What we sense closes off our ability to think about the umwelt of other creatures. And indeed, one of the pioneers of echolocation, a man named Donald Griffin, was himself skeptical about the existence of the magnetic sense in other animals. But once echolocation was discovered in bats, it became easier to learn about it and to find its presence in other animals. Dolphins echolocate as well. They use a kind of biological sonar underwater. And underwater, echolocation has unique properties that it doesn't have in the air. To successfully find an object with echolocation, you need to make a sound loud enough to travel out to the object and then make the return journey. In the air, that's really hard because sound loses energy very, very quickly. And so echolocation for a bat is only ever a short-range sense. A bat can detect a moth flying only about, say, 8 feet away from it. But underwater, sound travels much faster and further, and so dolphin echolocation works over a distance of half a mile or so. Also, the sound works differently when it interacts with other objects. So, say this dolphin is echolocating on these snorkelers next to it. The sounds it produces will penetrate through their flesh unimpeded, but it will bounce off things that have very different densities than water, such as lungs, which are full of air, and bones, which are very dense and strong. So this dolphin echolocating on these snorkelers can see inside their bodies as if it were a living medical scanner. It could perceive their skeleton, their airways. If one of them was pregnant, it could likely see the fetus. If one of them has shrapnel from an old injury, the dolphin could perceive that too. Dolphin sonar is so incredible that these animals can tell the difference between, say, two metal cylinders that differ in thickness by the width of a human hair, or two spheres that contain liquids of slightly different densities. Dolphins can even detect mines buried under the ocean floor, which is something no military sonar can do. Underwater, other kinds of extraordinary abilities become possible. So this is a black ghost knife fish. This animal lives in the Amazon in water where it's too turbid to see. But the fish doesn't need to see because it has this incredible ability to create and sense electric fields. It is basically a living battery. It generates its own electricity, not powerfully enough to stun or kill like an electric eel, but good enough to sense its surroundings. So the fish can detect how its own self-made electric fields are distorted by the objects around it, whether it's the insulating objects like rocks or conducting ones like plants or other animals. They can even communicate electrically. These fish can produce electric messages which others of their kind can receive. And if you take an electrode connected to a speaker and dip it into the waters of many rivers in South America and Africa, you will hear these buzzing electric choruses that we would otherwise be completely unable to perceive. We also can't perceive other stimuli in the water, like the tracks left behind by fish. Now, you might think it's impossible for a fish to leave a track. It's swimming in water. But indeed, fish leave behind turbulent currents as they swim, which persist for minutes after they have long since departed. We can't detect them. This animal can. This is a harbor seal. His name is Sprouts. He lives in California. Sprouts has this array of whiskers on his face, like all harbor seals do. And those absolutely are sensitive enough to detect the faint tracks left behind by swimming fish and to follow them. I have watched scientists move a tennis ball connected to the end of a pole in front of this seal through the water, up and down, left and right. And even though Sprouts is blindfolded, as in this image, he could still follow the path of the ball. And I don't mean in a very loose way. I don't mean that he knows the ball sort of over there, he can feel the waves, he heads in that direction. I mean, I have watched him follow the exact path of the ball, up and down, left and right, as if the two of them were connected by an invisible rope. These abilities seem extraordinary, perhaps even supernatural to us. And yet it's really important to understand that all of these senses have limitations. So the turtle's magnetic sense works really well over continental distances, but much, much less well over smaller scales. If you had magnetoreception as an ability, you could probably find your way from here to the East Coast, but not from your bedroom to the bathroom. The rattlesnake's infrared sense allows it to hunt in darkness, but the image that it provides is probably very, very low resolution. It's not going to be the sharp colored images that you see from infrared cameras or when sci-fi shows try to show a kind of heat, thermal sense. It's very, very, very fuzzy. And as we said, the bat's ability to echolocate only works over short distances. So An Immense World, my book about all of these animal senses, is not a book about super senses. It is a book about diversity and not superiority. My argument is that animals and their experiences of the world are worth knowing about, even when their abilities do not surpass our own. It is the fact that they are different that matters. It's the variation that counts. Even when their abilities are not superior to our own, they are worth thinking about because they stretch our perspectives. What are these? These are scallops. How many of you have actually seen a live scallop? Okay, so like not many. Some of you may not even have known that these things were animals, right? But you laugh. I get this all the time. What you see here, this delicious garlic sauteed puck of flesh on a plate, is the major muscle of an animal that actually exists in this beautiful shell that can open and shut so that the animal can swim like this weird panicked castanet. The shell looks like an ornamental fan. And at the rim of that shell are eyes. Dozens of eyes in some species, hundreds in others. The eyes can be really beautiful. These of the bay scallop look like neon blueberries to me. You might think that with such a wide array of eyes in every possible direction, the scallop would have this beautiful panoramic view of the world. And yet, those eyes, despite having pretty good optics, like they're decent cameras, are connected to a brain that is incredibly simple, and probably too simple to do much with the information provided by those hundreds of excellent cameras. So the scientists who study scallop vision have suggested to me that this is an animal that maybe doesn't see with scenes. It can see, it gets visual information about the world, but instead of each eye providing its own image, it's likely that the eye simply tells the scallop about whether something interesting is happening, say, in this part of its world, which it can then explore with other senses like taste and touch, the domain of those other tentacles that you can see in that image. So this is very, very different to how we experience vision, right? Vision for us is synonymous with this tableau that appears in front of our faces, this movie that plays out in our brains. It's very, very hard to imagine what it might be like to see without those kinds of scenes. The scallops remind us that even for vision, the sense that is most familiar to most of us, the ones who can see, that even for vision, things can work really differently in the rest of the animal kingdom. You have two eyes, they face forwards, and they are on your head. That's super weird, you guys. I don't know what to tell you. That is a very, very strange combination of traits for an animal. Most animals do something different in one of those domains. For example, most birds have eyes to the sides of their heads. Owls are an exception. And having eyes to the side of your head means that your visual world is wraparound, that it goes all the way around, perhaps even to right behind you. And that means that a bird's experience of vision is very different from yours and mine. When I walk, the visual world is in front of me and comes towards me. When a pigeon does, its visual world envelops it and goes towards it and away from it at the same time. Quite hard to imagine. Ducks have eyes not only on the sides of their heads, but a little bit above. And so these mallards sitting on a lake can see the entirety of the sky above them without needing to turn their heads. The next time you see a heron or an egret on a lake, note that even if the bird has its beak pointing straight ahead, even if it looks like it's standing staring outwards, it can still see the fish swimming beneath its feet. So even for something that we take for granted, which part of the world we can see, that also can vary in the animal across different species. So too can the number of eyes. We have two, one pair. This animal has 8 eyes. This is a jumping spider. Apologies to any arachnophobes in the audience. I happen to think this is extremely cute. Partly it's extremely cute because of those big central, like baby-like middle eyes. That central pair has very high resolution vision and can see in color. So jumping spider, even though it's about even though a jumping spider could sit happily on my pinky fingernail, it can still see the moon in the night sky. Now, you'll note that on the side of that central pair are a smaller pair, right? Those eyes see movement. And when I say they see movement, if you block them, the middle big pair can no longer track objects moving in front of the spider's visual field. If you block the side eyes, the spider becomes basically blind to movement, even though the front eyes can see really sharply and in color. This is an animal that has done division of labor with vision. It has separated different tasks that we only do with one pair of eyes, because we only have one pair of eyes, among different pairs. Our one pair of eyes, despite being few in number, are really, really good at one particular thing, which is acuity. Well, I guess not mine. I have -6 and -7.5 contacts in, but like in general, the human eyes are very, very sharp, much better than basically any other species, except for the birds of prey, hawks and eagles and other raptors. And that means that the kinds of things we see in nature are not really what other animals themselves see. On the right, that butterfly, if it were looking at another butterfly of its own kind, would only see a kind of smudgy orange-brown mess. Those spots are not visible to the butterfly itself. They're only visible to things like us, to the birds that might try and eat it. Those are the intended audiences for those patterns. And zebras, with their famous black and white stripes, have long been thought to use those stripes for some kind of camouflage. Maybe the stripes help the animals blend in among the dapple shade of trees, or confuse predators when the animals are all running next to each other. The problem with those ideas, which cannot possibly be right, is that a zebra's predators, lions and hyenas, cannot see those stripes at most distances. To a lion, a zebra mostly looks like a donkey. It's just gray. So why is zebra striped? You can ask me that in the Q&A. There's a trade-off with having very sharp eyes, which is that they don't work very well in the dark. It is why I honestly cannot see almost any of you, which is kind of weird from this podium. I assume you're there. Please laugh copiously at my jokes to reassure me of your presence. Eyes can do one of two things. They can either be very sharp or they can be very, very sensitive. They can never be both at once. And so we have gone for the first option. Other animals have done the latter. This is one of them. This is the giant squid, owner of the largest eyes on the planet. Its eyes are the size of soccer balls. That's extraordinary in its own right. But even weirder is the fact that the next biggest eyes on the planet, belonging to things like giant whales and swordfish, could fit inside the pupil of a giant squid's eye. So it's not just that these eyes are big, but that they are preposterously bigger than anything else that exists. Why is that? Why not just be a little bit bigger than a swordfish eye? Well, as eyes get bigger, they become more sensitive, and this animal lives in the deep, dark ocean, so it needs to have big eyes. Case closed, right? But as eyes get bigger, they also get more sensitive with diminishing returns. And there's not very much that you need an eye that big to see. In fact, there's only one category of things, and that is large, very large, glowing objects in total darkness. There's only one animal that's relevant to a giant squid that fits that description, and that's the sperm whale. Sperm whale don't glow themselves, but when they swim through the deep ocean, they do roil up other organisms and plankton that give off light. And so the largest eyes on the planet, those are the giant squid, seem to have evolved to detect the sparkly outlines of charging whales. We will never see that. Well, I will never see that. I don't want to crush your dreams. Feel free to have a go. But even things that we do see on a daily basis are going to look very, very different to our eyes than to those of even animals that we're very familiar with. Here's Typo again, with some of his favorite toys. Most of those toys are dead now. On the left is how I see that image, and on the right is what Typo sees. So it's a common myth that dogs only see in black and white. They do see in color, but fewer colors than us. We have 3 kinds of cones, color-sensing cells in our eyes. Dogs only have 2. They see about 100 times fewer colors than we can see, and their rainbow is much more limited. So their reds to us look like a kind of muddy yellow to them. Violet's going to look like a muddy blue. Greens are going to look like a white or a gray. Now, I said the word us. I should not have done that. Not every human sees in the same way. If any of you in the audience have red-green color blindness, those two images are not going to look any different to you, right? You're going to have the same kind of two-cone vision that many other mammals have. Now, even though I can see colors that typo can't see, like red, there are many colors that other animals can see that I can't see. Ultraviolet is one of them, just beyond the violet end of the rainbow. If you can see ultraviolet, many things in nature are going to have patterns that are unfamiliar to you. So here is a black-eyed Susan, a flower that, to the left, just looks plain yellow to the standard human eye. On the right is what it might look like to a bee, an eye that can see ultraviolet. You're going to get this beautiful, striking bullseye, this halo in the middle of the flower. Sunflowers are like this too. Many flowers have these kinds of markings, these halos, guiding, landing strips, are the kinds of marks that guide insects that can see UV to the flower. Birds also can see ultraviolet. Many birds that look the same to human eyes, where males and females are indistinguishable, are actually very, very distinguishable to the birds themselves. Male robins have a red breast that actually blazes with ultraviolet, and far more than the female robins, which also have red breasts, do. It's not just that the birds can see a slightly wider rainbow. It's that they can see an entire dimension of colors that we can't see. They have 4 kinds of cones, 4 kinds of color sensing cells in their eyes. So they're able to discriminate another 100 times more shades than we can see, and 10,000 more than what typo can. It's really, really hard to imagine what the world might look like to a hummingbird. Like, you can recolor parts of what you see to make one or a few of the multitude of hues that they can perceive that we can't. But you can't do that with all, whatever it is, 100 million colors they can perceive. 4 into 3 just doesn't go. This is the perennial problem of thinking about the sensory lives of other creatures. You cannot fully imagine what those lives are like. There is always going to be this gulf between our subjective perception of the world and theirs. The same is true for other individuals too. Thomas Nagel, an American philosopher, wrote about this very well in his classic essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? He argued that you could very well imagine flying through the air and eating insects and having leathery wings at the ends of your fingers, but you will never fully know what it is like to perceive the world through echolocation. It turns out bats are actually a very good choice for this thought experiment, because a few blind humans can echolocate. I met one of them, and I write about him in the book. His name is Daniel Kish. He's been blind from a very young age, but he now makes these loud, sharp clicking noises, much louder and much sharper than that, with his tongue as he walks. He still uses a cane, but he clicks too, and he can perceive the world through the echoes. I'll be walking along with Daniel, and he can tell if there's a branch lying across the path. He can tell me if we're passing cars or shrubbery or fences. He gets by really, really well. He's even gone mountain biking while echolocating. And yet, even though we're both the same species, and even though we both share the same language, it's still really hard for Daniel to explain to me what he perceives, in part because he uses visual words. He lives in a culture dominated by visually able people, and because there's simply no fully describing that interiority, that inner world that he has access to, but I do not. This is a challenge for someone whose entire book rests upon trying to get people to think about that world. I'm basically saying to you, I need you to make the effort to do something that you will never actually be able to do. My point is, however, that it is worth the effort, that there is glory and purpose in the attempt. And I think that for at least 4 different reasons. First, it radically changes our understanding of other animals and often counters some stereotypes we've had about them. This is a crocodile. It looks like an unfeeling armored tank. It looks like a brute, a thug. But along the rim of the crocodile's jaw are tiny bumps that are incredibly sensitive organs of touch. The crocodile can sense the faint ripples given off by prey drinking at the water's edge. Maybe it can even sense the movements of its own hatchlings, which mother crocodiles will dotingly carry in their mouths. So here is an animal that, far from being an unfeeling brute, is actually a paragon of delicate, sensitive touch. Rats and mice have been part of our world for centuries, as pets, as the subjects of laboratory experiments, and through almost all of that time, people have been unaware that they have been communicating with each other and anyone else who can hear with ultrasound, sound too high for us to perceive. Mice and rats will court each other by duetting ultrasonically. If you tickle a rat, it will giggle ultrasonically. So all this time, these very familiar animals had this kind of secret channel of communication. I mean, not secret to them, but one that we were oblivious to. The second reason is that thinking about other animals' senses changes our understanding of things that we just take for granted. Things that just seem so obvious as to be necessarily true, but actually aren't. How do you taste things? You put stuff in your mouth, right? Don't overthink this. You are a medium-sized animal. You eat by putting things in your mouth. That's how you taste, om nom nom. But if you are a very small animal, food can be something that you land upon. And so many insects have taste receptors on their feet. This fly is tasting the leaf simply by standing upon it. I would recommend that it moves a few inches to the right and taste the apple instead, but you do you, fly. What color is darkness? Black, right? Well, not quite. It's black to our eyes. Remember that I told you that our eyes are actually unusually insensitive in darkness. For many animals, the night is in fact bursting with color. This is one of them. This is the elephant hawk moth, very beautiful insect. If we were to turn off all the lights in this room, this animal would still be able to see color. It can tell the difference between differently colored flowers under darkness so dim that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Is ice cold? I seem high right now in asking these kinds of questions. Ice is not necessarily cold. Ice is frozen. That is an objective property of matter that doesn't change. But whether it is cold or not is subjective. It depends on the sensory abilities of the animal in question. And some animals that live in very cold environments have receptors for temperature that are set at very different thresholds than we do. So what counts as cold or hot to them is going to be different than for us. And indeed, many animals just simply don't have the ability to detect extreme cold at all. So like a cod in an Arctic lake isn't going to be sitting there suffering through the experience. It just won't feel the cold. Third reason, thinking about what other animals experience changes how we think about the world around us, even parts of the world that were very familiar. I've already said that when I go for walks with Typo, I understand that my neighborhoods are changing at a rate faster than my eyes can perceive, that new sources of scent, of smell, are bursting forth all the time. And there are parts of that change that aren't obvious to my eyes. There are whole layers of information even in my house or around my house that I am not privy to. When I go to green spaces, gardens, parks, I am now aware that those spaces are full of insects like this. This is a tree hopper. There are tens of thousands of species of tree hoppers out there. All of them vibrate their abdomens to send vibrational signals moving along the leaves and stems of the plants on which they stand, which can then be picked up by other tree hoppers sitting on the same plant. This is how they communicate. These seismic signals are not sounds as we typically know them. If you put your ear really close to one of these insects, you will hear nothing. But you can convert their signals into audible sounds with nothing more complicated than a clip-on microphone and a speaker. And if you do that, as some scientists have, what you hear is not the simple chirping not the simple chirping of an insect like a cicada or a cricket or any kind of insect sound that you might imagine. What you will hear are haunting, eerie melodies, like those created by birds or musical instruments or maybe even machinery. They'll seem alien and weird and completely unlike what you think an insect might sound like. The idea that all of the plants around us, all of the green spaces that we know so well, are full of these eerie vibrational melodies is kind of magical to me and tells me how much I'm missing in spaces that I care about. I also understand that how those spaces appear to my eyes has an interesting story behind them. So, we've already said that human eyes work differently than those of other animals, and we are not the intended audiences for the visual displays of flowers. In fact, the type of eye that is best at discriminating the colors of different flowers is basically a bee's eye. 3 color-sensing cells like ours, tuned to blue, green, and ultraviolet. This is the type of eye that theoretical simulations tell us is really exceptionally good at telling the difference between the colors of other flowers. So you might think, therefore, that bees evolved eyes that are really good at looking at flowers, which they pollinate. That is a completely reasonable thing to think that just happens to be completely wrong. Because, in fact, the bee eye came first. Flowers arrived on the evolutionary scene later. And so flowers evolved colors that ideally tickle the eyes of bees. And that's important because it is very easy to mistakenly think that the senses are entirely passive things. You are sitting there, you're not having to do very much. Light is going into your eyes, sound is going into your ears, smells are going into your nose. It feels like you are just this unmoving intaker of information from the world. But simply by doing that, simply by sensing and perceiving the world, you also change it. Simply by having eyes tuned to these particular wavelengths, bees dictated the form that beauty takes in every meadow in the world. We say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It also exists because of that eye. The fourth and final reason to care about this stuff is that I think it makes plain our responsibilities to the natural world and where we are failing in those responsibilities. Humans have flooded the night with light and the quiet with noise. And these kinds of pollution, light and noise pollution, sensory pollution, don't feel as viscerally off-putting to us as things like plastics on a beach or chemicals billowing from a smokestack, but they are nonetheless incredibly detrimental to the other creatures around us. Light at night pulls migrating birds away from the arduous journeys that they cannot afford a detour from. It pulls pollinating insects away from the plants they are meant to service. It pulls hatchling sea turtles away from the ocean onto roads and towns with fatal results. Noise in land and in the ocean drowns out the communication calls, the alarm calls, the courtship displays that other animals need to hear. It can push animals away from habitats that would be ideal for them. It can make them vulnerable to collisions and to predators. Both of these problems are getting worse all the time. The proportion of the planet that is now unaffected by light pollution is very small and shrinking with every year. Similarly, much of the world is getting louder all the time, both on land and in the sea. Sensory pollution is the pollution of disconnection. It severs animals from the information that they need to perceive in the world, and it severs us from the natural world itself. There is a reason why in the early pandemic, many people talked about how they could suddenly hear birds around them. It wasn't that the birds were just like taking back the cities that humans had vacated, hashtag nature is healing. It was simply that because people were quieter and less out and about, they became more aware of the kinds of sounds that were there all the time. They could hear more, and they could hear over larger ranges. Without that, with those sounds drowned out, with the beauty of the night sky blotted out by our own artificial lights, I think nature becomes more distant to us. It inadvertently promotes the sense that nature is synonymous with these grand landscapes like Yosemite and Yellowstone, like places that sure are wonderful, but are very far away from our everyday world. It makes the idea of wilderness feel like something that most of us don't actually access. And if things aren't part of your daily lives, if you don't feel them, if you don't care about them, why would you want to protect them? I think instead that nature is like this, that it is literally in our backyard. It is in the wilds of perception, in the strange ways in which my dog perceives the world, or this crow perceives the world, or my dog and the crow perceive each other. By thinking about what other animals experience, I understand that there is unfamiliarity and wonder to be found everywhere I look, even in the most humdrum and everyday of settings. And by thinking about the senses of other animals, I get to go on these incredible journeys. I get to go on grand adventures without going anywhere. And even when I go to places, I can go on grand adventures by simply paying attention with my other senses. I got into town yesterday, and I went straight from the airport to Veterans Park, where I found an eastern screech owl, a beautiful animal who was roosting in a tree and who sounds like this. No, sounds not like that. You're going to hear mostly what sounds like ambient rustling, but then beyond that, a kind of hear that? It's a beautiful sound. I love birding because it makes me pay attention to the natural world with all of my senses, with sight, with sound, sometimes even with touch. It's truly mesmerizing to have a flock of birds fly so close that you can feel the breeze created by their wings on your face. Doing this makes me feel more in touch with the natural world and more eager to know about it, to savor it, and to cherish it. This is a gift. I think it is a gift that perhaps only humans possess. I don't think my dog is sitting there wondering about the bird sense of smell. I don't think the crow is sitting there wondering what colors my dog sees. I can do both of those things. And that is not an ability to be taken lightly or to be used infrequently. It is something that we should, I think about all the time and to make full use of. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yong. I would invite audience members who have questions to text their questions to the number that's printed in your program. I'll read the number aloud in a moment once I finish logging onto my computer. But I appreciate being set up with the first question ahead of time because I'm quite sure somebody has already texted, why do zebras have stripes?
It's great. I also really hate usually standing behind a podium, so it's nice to be able to free range on the stage now. Zebras have stripes as anti-fly defenses. So there's something about the stripes that baffles the eyes of biting flies. If you've ever watched a horsefly try and land on a zebra, as some scientists have, it will always flub the landing. You could even put a zebra-striped coat onto a normal horse and watch flies also fail to bite it. Why this works is still a bit unclear. Why zebras need the protection is a bit clearer. They have coats that are unusually thin for horses, and they live in parts of the world where biting flies transmit a lot of diseases that are very dangerous and fatal for horses. So in response to the greater need and the weaker innate defenses, they've evolved this weirdo pattern that seems to act as anti-fly armor.
Thank you. So let me now read aloud the number to which you can text your questions, 859-379-9798. The next question we've received is, where did the dogs only see in black and white myth come from in the first place?
That is a really good question, and I actually don't know the answer to that. It was prevalent enough that, does anyone remember a cartoon called The Far Side by Gary Larson? Right, there was like a very famous Far Side cartoon with a dog sitting on, at the side of the bed praying for him and Mom and Dad and Ginger and Fido to be able to see in color at last. I don't know. And actually, the whole area of sensory biology is kind of full of these, these myths, these like factoids that everyone kind of takes for granted until someone actually does the hard work of working out if it's true or not. Yeah.
Great. The next question. Have you talked with individuals who have thought about using umwelt to inform the design of things like bird feeders or animal toys for animals in the wild or in captivity?
Yeah, great question. The example that springs most readily to mind, there are a couple of scientists in Britain who've looked at who've worked with horses and have looked at the kinds of colors that horses can see, and it's basically the same as what typo can see. A lot of mammals have that kind of two-cone vision, and it means that a lot of the this is a good anecdote for Kentucky. A lot of the colors that get used in like signals, at least in British racecourses, are actually really bad for like horse vision. They don't really stand out to the horses themselves. If you wanted colors that really stood out to the horses, you would use things like bright yellows and bright blues. Orange, which dominates a lot of British racetracks, is no good. So yeah, that's one way. There are a lot of products that are meant to that apparently are designed with the sensory worlds of other animals in mind. There are shark suits that apparently deter sharks by messing with their electric sensors. There are ultrasonic repellents that are meant to deter animals from your backyard by producing nasty ultrasound. I regret to inform you that none of those work. And they don't work specifically because of a range issue. So ultrasound doesn't travel very far, and a shark's electric sense, the ability to detect the electric fields of other animals, is also very short range. So the ultrasound device in your backyard is really only going to put off an animal that is like right next to it. And the anti-shark suit is really only going to work if the shark is like here. And the shark can sense you in other ways, right? Once it's here.
Thank you. So the question says, I've always been interested in how humans perceive music. We can even recognize when super close frequencies sound wrong together. Why do you think humans developed this skill, and do other animals have this level of music perception?
So I cannot speak to why humans developed this skill, but I can talk about how music is perceived for some other creatures. And in the book, I write a lot about songbirds. You think humans are good at this. Birds are incredible at it. And birds will hear qualities in their own songs that our ears absolutely cannot detect. This is not quite an issue of pitch. It's not about ultrasound or infrasound. A bird's frequency range tends to be quite similar to ours. This is a question of timing. So birds just have, a loose way of saying it is faster hearing. So they can hear very, very fast changes in pitch and in volume that our ears absolutely cannot make out. If you've ever listened to a bird singing and thought, wow, there's a lot going on there, I bet I'm missing stuff out, you are. And for a lot of species, it's actually the very, very fast and tiny changes in pitch and volume that they're really looking for. That is what is encoding information. Birders will know that people tend to transliterate birdsong into syllables and notes that we can think about and memorize. For a lot of birds, that syllable structure actually doesn't matter, right? So you can chop and change different notes, and the birds won't care. It's the detail, it's the minutiae of the note itself. It's all the tiny changes going on within it that they care about. If any of you, does anyone here use the Merlin app? Actually, quite a lot. Great. More of you should. It's great. It is an app that identifies bird song in real time. So if you hear a bird singing, you can turn the app on, hold it up, and it will tell you which species is currently vocalizing. It also displays a spectrogram, so visualization of the volume and frequency in a way that you can look at. And the next time you use Merlin, just look at that. Like, just notice how much change is going on, how many different harmonics are layered on top of each other, how what seems like one note is actually like a big up and down shape. There's lots going on there, and it gives you a sense of what birds are perceiving in their own music.
Shifting gears slightly, as aspiring writers here in the audience, some students, some others, what advice do you give us, what do you have for us as a decorated author? How can you help us hone our craft?
Great. Get out. No, don't. It'll be fine. So my usual advice are the following. First, read actively. We tend to consume media in a passive way, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I just mean like we take it in, that's it. When I say actively, I mean ask questions about the craft of the work that you are reading. Ask, how has this author structured the start of this piece of work, the end? How have they used quotes? How have they used metaphors? How have they bracketed a book into chapters, chapters into sections, sections into paragraphs? It turns out that most of the tricks and techniques that people like me use in my work are actually very transparent. They're there on the page, right? You can reverse engineer it and learn it for yourself simply by paying close attention to the text. That's one tip. So when you read something that you think is good, like hopefully an immense will, try and work out like why it's good. Like, why are you responding to this? Which bits of it are important to you? That gives you actually a huge education in writing that you can, self-audit. My other tip is just you got to write. Like, if you want to write, you have to do a lot of it. You have to do a lot of it because that's the only way of getting better. Well, that's the main way of getting better. The other way is to work with a really good editor. And for those of you who want to be writers, I would highly recommend getting yourself into situations where you are working with really good editors. That will greatly accelerate your improvement. But you have to do the work to get better at it. And I guess my final tip is, it's very easy to think of writing as this kind of magical thing, and lots of our cultural tropes revolve around that idea. You have this idea of like the tortured writer staying up till like 2 in the morning, agonizing over every word. That's true. But it doesn't have to be. I've actually really enjoyed writing both of my books. And I think in part that comes from being very clear at the start about what I'm trying to do. I've often said to writing students that writing is not magic. Writing is intentionality times practice. It is being very clear about what you're trying to achieve at every level of the piece of work. So I know with this book what every chapter is about. More than that, I know what every section of every chapter is meant to do. And I don't mean just like what information it's trying to convey, but why it's there, why it deserves to be part of the book, what kinds of feelings or reactions I'm trying to engender from the audience from this particular chapter, or this particular section, or this particular paragraph. I often have all of that mapped out before I start writing. Now, for some people, the writing is part of the process. I get that. But my point is, I'm very organized, and I'm very intentional about what I'm doing. I don't just open a blank screen and start writing and let the muse take me. And I think that level of thought and detail is important, partly because it helps you, right? Like it makes the process of writing that much easier, but also it's a lot to ask someone to pick up a book. Books are not cheap, and they take a lot of time to work their way through. So my bargain with someone is if you pick up the book and make that effort, I will not waste your time.
With your indulgence, I'd like to offer two questions that I think may relate. In your talk and in your book, you speak about light and noise pollution. How do you imagine that these will affect humans going forward? Will we perceive less of the world around us and become vulnerable and disconnected, or will we develop some kind of superhuman skill to navigate better? Second, how do you feel about the attempts to expand the human vault through technology, for example, tactile vests for piloting planes?
Yeah, those are great questions. Look, I don't think like light and noise pollution are harming us in the same way as other animals, right? We have other ways of finding our way around the world. It's not like we're going to develop like some super sense because we can't see or hear anymore. The problem, as I mentioned in the talk, is that both of these things make the natural world impoverished and distant for us. And I think as a consequence, it makes us less likely to want to care about it and to protect it at a time when it is in dire need of care and protection. To the second piece, I think some of that tech could have interesting and very specific applications. So the questioner highlighted one of them. But so, when I wrote the proposal for this book, I actually planned to do an entire chapter on technology, on using tech to improve, to expand our own umwelt. And I eventually just dropped that idea because all of the examples I found just seemed a bit boring, and just seemed like there wasn't a there, because actually my strong feeling is technology is of limited use in getting us to experience what other animals are experiencing, with some limited exceptions, right? Like night vision goggles can show you what an animal that sees in the dark is seeing. Great. But it is actually impossible to use tech to show a person, say, the wraparound vision of a mallard. And that's because I can wear goggles that show me what is going on behind my head, but that is not the same as having wraparound vision. And those goggles still have to input information into my two forward-facing eyes. Similarly, I cannot see the four-dimensional colors that a hummingbird can see. It simply doesn't map on to my three-dimensional color vision. I can get down really close to the floor and sniff what my dog is sniffing, but I have neither the hardware nor the software, the anatomy nor the nervous system to process what my dog is smelling. So, Thomas Nagel's thing still stands. There is always that chasm. Tech can't bridge it. think much more powerful than technology is our imagination, our curiosity, our empathy. These are things that I think get us a lot further in trying to appreciate what other animals are experiencing, and importantly, in wanting to make the effort in the first place.
Thank you. Let me comment that I've never seen this many questions coming in, so we won't be able to get to all of them. Could we do 3 or 4 more questions? Great. If you could trade one of your senses for one of an animal that you've studied, what would you trade and for what replacement?
Ah. I've never been asked that question that way before. Okay, so let's work through it. Not vision, because so much of my work is visual and I need that day to day. Not touch, because you would be surprised how debilitating and lack of touch can be. It's like, I feel like if we ranked them, touch first. Smell is the grounding of most of our enjoyment of food. So that stays. I feel like hearing might have to go. I feel like, but you know, look, I just want to be sensitive when I answer this question that, like, obviously a lot of people already do not have one of these senses, right? There are many people who do not see. There are many people who do not smell. There are many people who do not hear. No one does not touch. Some people do not taste, right? So it's like, this is a fanciful thought experiment for me, but like this is just the lived reality for many people who get along perfectly fine without one of these senses. If I was to pick one to have, so I think dolphin sonar would be very interesting. In part because the ability to peer inside other bodies is a very, very different way of experiencing the world, and because I think the way sonar works as dolphins use it is always exploratory, right? So it's not just hearing, even though it's to do with sound. Without the call, there is no echo. So the dolphin is always making effort in order to explore the world, and it changes the nature of its sonar pulses depending on the kinds of information it's trying to wrest from its environment. So it is always exploratory. To me, dolphin sonar echolocation is not really like hearing. It's actually more like touch. It's like the dolphin is reaching out with ghostly hands and grasping the world around it. I think that would be cool. But you know, this is not one of the senses that this is not a sense that I do not have, but I think if I were to have the sensory world of another animal for a little bit, temporarily, note, I'd probably pick my dog. And not because I necessarily want to smell everything that Typo smells, but because I think that, you know, having that would make me closer to him. I would understand his needs more, what he perceives of the world. I would understand his ridiculous little mind a little better, and it would make me a better friend and parent to him.
We have 5 or 6 questions along the lines of, tell us more about human echolocation.
Yeah.
How do you figure that out? Can anybody learn it?
Yeah, I think anyone can learn it. Daniel Kish, who I talked about, did it from a very young age. He started just clicking with his tongue. He wasn't like taught, he didn't go to a program, he just worked out how to do it himself. Crucially, no one told him to not make clicking noises with his tongue. And so he just developed the skill on his own. What's interesting talking to Daniel about echolocation is it makes clear what the strengths and weaknesses of that sense are that are different from how we normally use our hearing, right? So if you're navigating with sound, sound moves through solid surfaces and goes around corners, so you can absolutely I could echolocate someone standing behind that curtain, could echolocate on things behind me, I could echolocate on things standing behind that door. In many ways, the sense is kind of magical that way. But there are certain things that basically create illusions with echolocation that, work very differently for vision. So for example, I could absolutely echolocate on this podium here, but I would have no way of finding that credit card on the podium. So small things sitting on or standing against big things basically become camouflage to echolocation, because the echoes from the big thing drown out the echoes from the small things. Textures, fuzzy textures, also reduce softer echoes. So if I wanted to hide from Daniel, I would just do this. Now you can very obviously see me, but I would now be pretty well camouflaged to someone who is mainly relying on echolocation. The final thing I will say about this is that the paper in which Donald Griffin, pioneer of bat echolocation, described echolocation and coined it as a word in 1944 is about echolocation in bats and humans. So we've known about this for a very long time, and everyone forgets the humans bit, including a lot of scientists who work on echolocation, who have no idea that humans can actually do this too. I think that speaks to this very pervasive sense of ableism that is in part of our society, where we kind of discount the incredible things that people with disabilities are capable of. And sometimes when we think about those things, the tendency is either to stigmatize or ignore people with disabilities, or treat them as like superheroes, right? Daniel gets treated this way a lot, like his echolocation is some kind of superpower. It's not really any of those things. It's just a different way of experiencing the world and living in it.
Thank you. Here's my final question. Will you please discuss the role of science journalism in a time of so much science denialism?
It's a nice softball question to end the evening. How long have you guys got? I think about this question in a very different way than I used to do, because I think that this idea of science denialism is too crude. Often when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about trivia, right? Like, is this right or wrong? Do vaccines cause autism? If you say yes, you're a science denier. Does climate change exist? If you say no, you're a science denier. These things are important to know and to get right, of course. I'm not saying that they're not. But I've also worked in a lot of different fields and written about a lot of different things where what is true is more complicated, and where sources of misinformation can be unexpected. So for example, I've done a lot of work on long COVID, on the long-term consequences of a COVID infection. Many people who get COVID are still sick for months or years after their initial bout to the virus. The symptoms can be devastating. It can be hugely diverse. They often include things like extreme fatigue that doesn't get better with rest, post-exertional malaise, where all of your symptoms get much, much worse, where you undergo radical physiological crashes where possibility is annihilated after even mild physical exertion. Brain fog, where you cannot concentrate on even simple daily things. All of these symptoms are also very subjective. So people who experience long COVID are always told that they are just depressed, that they're stressed, they're making it up. When people say, I'm fatigued, I'm brain fogged, people tend to say, oh, I'm also tired, everyone gets tired, we're all just getting older. They get dismissed. That dismissal also comes from the medical establishment, from a lot of doctors and medical providers who are themselves meant to be evidence-based sources of information, who have the right training to know that climate change exists and the vaccines don't cause autism, but are nonetheless promulgating some extremely harmful tropes that do a disservice to a lot of people who need their help. So long COVID makes me understand that this question of which information is right, who is providing it, is just often a lot more complicated than we normally perceive. Why is there so much bias against this condition when actually it is very, so backing up a little bit, long COVID is also very similar to a lot of other conditions that have pre-existed, that have existed long before the pandemic, things like ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There's a whole cavalcade of these that are massively neglected and that go through, whose sufferers go through exactly the same kind of societal denial, dismissal. Why is that? Well, in part, it's because we live in a highly ableist society where people's value is tied to their productivity, and here are illnesses that, in depleting people's energy, makes it almost impossible to be productive. And so these people are deemed as being of less value. These conditions disproportionately affect women, whose pain is often pathologized and trivialized by the medical establishment. There's a long history of doing that. They're called hysterical and so on. And because of a lot of these biases, not only are these patients disbelieved, but there's very, very little research on these conditions. And the lack of research then becomes source for further skepticism. We don't know enough, so clearly it's not a thing. You know, if these were serious problems, people would know more about them. And it just becomes this vicious, self-fulfilling cycle. So, right, what people's reaction to these things depends not only on the availability of facts, but also not just on the process by which knowledge is constructed. To depend on the values that animate our society or that hold them back. And I think science journalism, to get back to the original question, can act as an antidote to that. Like, in its highest form, in its highest purpose, we should not just be telling people about science, full stop, but we should be holding science to account. We should be showing that science is itself a process by which we very slowly stumble towards a slightly reduced sense of uncertainty about the world. It's not just a procession of facts and truths. It is a very human endeavor. And I think really good science journalism gets at that. It talks about information that people need to know, but also serves the needs of communities of people like long haulers whose needs are not being served. And you know, there's all the usual stuff about speaking truth to power, about giving voice to the voiceless, and like all of those are really important parts of journalism. We sometimes forget them with science coverage, but they're important in that too.
Thank you.